committed the perfect crime.
Within minutes, they had your DNA, like a calling card. You were that careless, that foolish, that stupid. Master degree, you're a joke. Complete joke. The world's watching because of the kids, not because of you. Nobody cares about you.
There's no place for you in heaven. You took our children. You are gonna suffer, man. I'm shaking because I want to reach out to you, but I hope you feel my energy, okay?
Kohberger.
I will call you what you are. Sociopath, psychopath, murderer.
The grieving families of his victims.
There is a specific kind of quiet that exists inside a maximum security prison at 3 in the morning. Not peaceful. Not restful. Just the absence of everything that once made a person feel like they existed in the world. Bryan Kohberger is living inside that quiet right now. Every single night. And he will be for the rest of his life. Welcome to the Evidence Hollow. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe before we go any further, because this channel covers real cases built entirely on documented facts, verified records, and nothing that cannot be traced to a credible source. And if this video finds something in you that needs to be found, hit the like button. It helps more people find this story. Now stay with me, because what happened after that courtroom emptied is not the story most people think they followed. Bryan Kohberger is 30 years old. He is currently housed inside Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho. He has been there since July 23, 2025. His cell measures 6 feet by 9 feet. He spends 23 hours of every day inside it. The remaining hour is spent in a concrete outdoor enclosure open only to a narrow rectangle of sky directly above, surrounded on all sides by fencing and wire. No grass. No horizon. No sense of the world beyond those walls. Every door he passes through is operated remotely from a central control station. He never touches a lock. Every movement he makes through that facility is made in physical restraints. That is not a temporary arrangement. That is not a phase of adjustment before something more manageable begins. That is the architecture of the rest of his life. Every morning he wakes up to it, and every morning it will be identical to the one before. To understand how he arrived at that cell, you have to go back to November 13, 2022. In a rental house at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, 4 University of Idaho students were killed in the early morning hours. Madison Mogan was 21 years old, from Sandpoint, Idaho, studying marketing. Kaylee Goncalves was 21, from Rathdrum, Idaho, described by everyone who knew her as fierce and deeply loving. Xana Kernadal was 20, from Post Falls, Idaho, known for her warmth and her closeness to the people around her. Ethan Chapin was 20, from Conway, Washington, a member of Sigma Chi, visiting that night because his girlfriend Xana lived there. He did not live in that house. He was simply there because that was where she was. All 4 were killed with a fixed-blade knife in the early morning hours while most of the house was asleep. 2 other residents survived. The medical examiner confirmed multiple stab wounds on each victim. What happened inside that house in those hours is one of the most documented and closely examined crime scenes in Idaho's recent history. And for 6 weeks after it happened, no one publicly knew who was responsible. The investigation that followed involved Moscow police, the Idaho State Police, and the FBI. Thousands of tips came in. The community lived in a sustained state of fear. Incorrect names circulated online. Innocent people were harassed. And the person responsible had already begun driving cross-country to Pennsylvania. The break in the case came through DNA. A K-bar-style knife sheath was recovered at the crime scene. DNA from that sheath was entered into a genealogical database. A paternal familial match was identified. Investigators then obtained DNA from discarded material left outside the Kohberger family's Pennsylvania home during the holiday period. That sample confirmed a familial match to the sheath DNA. Bryan Kohberger was identified as the likely source. Cell phone data placed him in the vicinity of the King Road house on the night of the murders. Surveillance footage captured his white Hyundai Elantra in the area on multiple occasions, including prior visits that suggested the house had been observed before November 13. He was arrested on December 30, 2022, at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. He was extradited to Idaho in January 2023. At the time of his arrest, he was a PhD student in the criminology department at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, 8 miles from Moscow. He had also been working as a teaching assistant in that department. He had spent years studying criminal behavior at an academic level, writing about institutional systems, analyzing why people who ended up in correctional facilities made the choices they made. He had studied this from the inside of a university. He is now studying it from the inside of something else entirely. Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The prosecution sought the death penalty. His legal proceedings stretched across more than 2 years, involving extensive pretrial motions, challenges to the DNA evidence, a successful change of venue from Lotta County to Ada County, and a legal process that for most of its duration appeared to be heading toward one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Idaho's history. 3 weeks before jury selection was scheduled to begin, the defense requested a plea agreement. On July 2, 2025, Bryan Kohberger entered a guilty plea in an Ada County courtroom. He confirmed, separately, for each of the 4 students whose lives ended on November 13, 2022, that he was responsible, that he had acted willingly and deliberately with premeditation. In exchange, the death penalty was removed from consideration. What he received instead were 4 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole and no right to appeal. Sentencing took place on July 23, 2025. The courtroom was full. Families who had spent 2.5 years waiting for that day. Legal teams. Journalists. And at the center of it, Kohberger, seated at the defense table, hands folded, face entirely unreadable. Judge Stephen Hippler had presided over the case from the beginning. When he addressed Kohberger directly, he did not reach for measured detachment. He told the courtroom he could find nothing redeeming in the man before him, that whatever might once have been decent had been buried beneath what he chose to do. He said plainly there was nothing worth salvaging. Kohberger did not react. No shift in expression. No change in posture. The victim impact statements followed. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, stood and looked directly at Kohberger without looking away. He told him he would spend the rest of his life in misery. He told him he was now officially the property of the state of Idaho. That phrase was not only emotional. It was accurate. From that moment forward, every hour of Kohberger's day, every decision about where he ate and when he slept and when he could step outside, belonged to an institution. The same kind of institution he had once examined from the safety of a seminar room. Hours later, with no cameras and no statement from the defense, a transport vehicle left Ada County heading south. 30 miles to Kuna, Idaho. 30 miles to Idaho Maximum Security Institution. And what waited for him there was something no academic paper he had ever written had described from the inside. He was placed in J Block, the facility's long-term restrictive housing unit. Approximately 30 people are held there at any given time. Every one of them assessed by the institution as requiring separation from the broader population. His neighbors included some of the most serious long-term offenders in Idaho's correctional history. Some had been inside that unit for years. Some arrived knowing they would never leave. Over time, they had reached something that researchers describe not as peace or acceptance, but as a complete flattening of expectation. The routine had stopped happening to them. It had simply become what existing felt like. Kohberger arrived. He had not reached that state. He has not reached it yet. What peer-reviewed research documents about prolonged restrictive confinement goes far beyond the word boredom, which is where most coverage stops. Researchers define it as isolation exceeding 22 hours per day sustained across weeks and months. At that threshold, 3 neurological effects appear consistently across independent studies. The first is sensory hypersensitivity. When the brain receives almost no varied input over an extended period, it recalibrates. Sounds that would ordinarily go unnoticed begin to register as significant. Unexpected interaction, rather than feeling like relief, can feel disorienting. This is not a psychological weakness. It is a documented neurological adjustment. The second is temporal compression. Memory depends on the ability to distinguish one day from the next. When days become structurally identical, that process breaks down. Weeks accumulate without feeling meaningfully different from one another. The third, and the most consequential over time, is identity erosion. Identity is not a fixed internal quality. It is an ongoing process maintained through interaction, through the roles we perform, through the feedback those roles generate. Remove that structure and maintaining a coherent sense of self becomes progressively harder. Researchers document individuals in extended segregation who can no longer describe themselves beyond their immediate physical surroundings. Not who they were. Not what they valued. Only what is directly in front of them. Now place that onto Kohberger specifically. His identity was constructed almost entirely around intellect, academic standing, and the specific credential of understanding criminal behavior at a level most people never reach. In J Block, there are no students, no colleagues, no institution confirming his status as anything other than a case number. The person he understood himself to be has no framework in which to function or be recognized. He had spent years studying this process in other people. And that is exactly where part 2 begins. If you are still here, you already know this channel is different. The evidence hollow does not fill gaps with speculation. Every claim you just heard is documented. If this kind of storytelling is what you have been looking for, subscribe now and make sure you have notifications turned on, because part 2 goes somewhere the first half only points toward. Like this video before you leave. It tells the algorithm this story deserves to be seen. We will see you in part 2. 3 weeks. 5 formal complaints in 22 days. A commissary account, a ventilation system, deliberate cell flooding, an incomplete meal tray, and a missing personal property bag. That was the paper trail Bryan Kohberger had generated inside Idaho Maximum Security Institution by the time August arrived. Paul Merrow, a retired NYPD inspector who reviewed the publicly reported details, said Kohberger appeared overly focused on minor issues in a way that did not reflect someone adjusting to long-term confinement. Keith Ravier, a former prison minister, was more direct. Inmates in units like J Block learn quickly who can absorb pressure and who cannot. Filing repeatedly about small things sends a signal throughout the unit. And that signal, Ravier said, does not work in your favor. Every form Kohberger submitted was telling the people around him something he had not intended to communicate. That the pressure was reaching him. That the environment was affecting him. That he had not yet accepted what every long-term person in that unit had already accepted, that the system was not going to bend toward him regardless of how clearly or carefully he made his case. He was still writing to an institution as though it owed him a response. It did not. On August 12, 2025, 3 weeks into his sentence, the Idaho Department of Correction convened a formal housing placement hearing for Bryan Kohberger. A 3-member committee. Kohberger present. The purpose was to evaluate whether his current placement inside J Block remained appropriate. What happened inside that room was not what anyone expected. For the first time since his arrest in December 2022, Kohberger showed something that witnesses described as genuine self-awareness. Without being prompted, he acknowledged that the pressure from other inmates through the ventilation system would likely decrease as public attention on his case faded. He understood that his national profile was a direct factor in making him a target inside that unit. He stated it clearly. And he was right. That is exactly how those dynamics function inside long-term restrictive housing. High-profile arrivals draw concentrated attention. As outside coverage fades, so does the incentive. Then came his requests. Solo recreation time, not integrated with other inmates. Individual escorts through the facility rather than group movements. Access to structured work assignments when they became available. And then the most revealing request of all. He asked for the same specific recreation privileges that another named high-profile person already housed in J Block was receiving. He had been watching. He had identified who else in that unit held a comparable profile. He had assessed what accommodations that person had been granted. And he used a formal hearing to request equivalent terms. Even in that room, before a committee with complete authority over every hour of his daily existence, he was doing what he had always done. Analyzing the structure, identifying what was available, positioning himself within the constraints. The committee's response was straightforward. Remain in administrative segregation. Same unit. Same tier. Same cell. A spokesperson for the Idaho Department of Correction confirmed afterward that J Block staff maintained a safe and orderly environment for all people in custody. The voices through the vents, the flooding, the sustained low-level pressure, none of it was characterized as a problem requiring a solution, because within the institutional framework, it was not a malfunction. It was the environment. Cameron Lindsay, speaking to Fox News Digital, said Kohberger's housing situation was unlikely to change for the foreseeable future. The placement, he said, protected everyone, including Kohberger himself. 5 complaints. 1 hearing. 3 requests denied. The same cell door closing behind him every night. The system had heard everything he submitted, processed every argument, and returned the same answer each time. This is where you are. Nothing you file changes that. There is only this. Then something happened that Kohberger had almost certainly never fully accounted for. In mid-August 2025, reports began circulating online, unverified but widely shared, that short clips of Kohberger inside his cell had been secretly recorded and distributed on social media. The Idaho Department of Correction opened an internal investigation immediately. Every staff member was placed on formal notice. Unauthorized recording or distribution of footage from inside the facility carried severe disciplinary and potential legal consequences. The footage was never officially confirmed as authentic. No individual was ever publicly identified as responsible. But consider what that moment represented. Prosecutors had described Kohberger throughout the legal proceedings as someone who operated with a deliberate awareness of how evidence works. Someone who understood what could be traced and what could not. Someone careful about his own exposure within the systems he moved through. That version of him no longer existed. Inside a maximum security cell with a door that opens on someone else's schedule and a slot at its base through which a phone could theoretically be pointed at any moment, he had no ability to manage how he was seen. The control he had exercised so carefully outside those walls was simply gone. He eats when the tray arrives. He sleeps when the lights change. He moves along a route chosen by an escort he had no part in selecting. And in that same period, he sent a handwritten note to a correctional staff member. A thank you. Because the commissary account that had triggered his very first complaint on day 4 had finally been configured correctly. A man pursuing a doctorate in the study of human decision-making, writing a thank you note to a prison staff member because an electronic payment account was now functional. This is not a dramatic reversal. It is something quieter and more telling. It is what daily life looks like when its available dimensions have contracted to their smallest possible size. When a working account or a complete meal tray is the largest available victory a day can offer, those things expand to fill the entire frame. Every functional thing becomes significant. Every minor disruption becomes a crisis. Not because of weakness. Because there is nothing else. And that contraction is not temporary. It is what every day looks like from here. Here is the question that nobody asked out loud in that courtroom on July 23, 2025. Is what Bryan Kohberger chose actually harder than what he avoided? In 1994, the United States Supreme Court heard Simmons v. South Carolina. The central issue was whether juries fully understood what permanent confinement without the possibility of release actually meant. The court found that when juries lacked complete information about the permanence of that sentence, it affected how they weighed their options. The implication has never been fully resolved. Permanent confinement is not automatically the lesser outcome. For some people, in some circumstances, it is the harder one. Researchers who studied this question directly, including studies where incarcerated individuals considered the choice hypothetically, found a result that consistently surprises people. A significant percentage, when faced with a specific choice between permanent restrictive confinement and a definitive ending, chose the ending. Not out of despair. Because permanent isolation with no horizon, no point where something changes, did not register to them as a form of living. It registered as something drawn out and inescapable. Kohberger chose differently. On July 2, 2025, he entered his guilty plea. He confirmed, separately, for each of the 4 people whose lives he ended, that he had acted willingly, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation. The judge asked him individually each time. He answered yes. In exchange, the most severe sentencing option was removed entirely. What he received instead were 4 consecutive life sentences. No parole. No appeal. No future legal avenue leading anywhere other than that cell. He chose the concrete enclosure, the 23 hours, the voices through the vents, the written forms that come back with the answer already decided, the thank you note for a working payment account, and the identical days stretching forward without a finish line. He chose this over the alternative. Whether that reflects fear, calculation, or something else entirely, only he knows. What is not in question is the outcome. He is 30 years old. He is in J Block. And he will be there, in that same unit, on that same schedule, until his body can no longer sustain itself inside those walls. The families who lost the most did not all experience that outcome the same way. For the Goncalves family and the Kernodle family, the plea felt like a second loss. They were not consulted before the decision was made. The first they knew of it was a letter informing them that a plea had been requested by the defense, weeks before the trial they had spent years preparing for was set to begin. Steve Goncalves spoke about this publicly. He said the process had failed his family. That something was taken from them not only in November 2022, but again in the summer of 2025. For the Mogan family and the Chapin family, the outcome was something they could accept. No trial meant no years of additional proceedings. No weeks inside a courtroom while evidence surrounding their children was examined publicly. The door closed. Not without grief, but it closed. James Allen Fox, a criminologist at Northeastern University, addressed the underlying reality plainly. The prosecution represents the state, not the individual families. The state's calculation was legally sound. A guaranteed permanent sentence with no risk of an unexpected verdict and no decade of appeals to follow. From an institutional standpoint, that decision made sense. Both things are true at the same time. The families who felt failed are not wrong. The state that made a legal calculation is not wrong either. What sits between those two truths is something the legal system was never designed to resolve, the gap between institutional justice and personal justice. Those two things are not always the same. Judge Hippler said something at sentencing that has remained with everyone who heard it. He said Bryan Kohberger's motive may never be fully understood. That the truth of what drove him to that house on November 13, 2022 may never be available. Not to the families, not to the public, not to the historical record. Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. None of them had reached their 22nd birthday. None of them had any say in what happened to them or how their lives ended. The research on long-term confinement is consistent on what comes next for Kohberger. The environment that initially feels intolerable does not stay that way. Not because it improves. Because the brain adapts to whatever it is given. The routine stops feeling imposed and starts feeling like simply what existing is. That is not peace. It is not resolution. It is the mind doing what it must to keep functioning inside conditions it was never designed for. Kohberger will live inside that adaptation for decades. What makes that particularly striking is this. Bryan Kohberger did not stumble into criminology. He chose it as his life's academic focus. His doctoral research at Washington State University centered specifically on criminal decision-making, on why people make choices that permanently alter their own lives alongside the lives of others. He had studied the literature on long-term incarceration. He understood what extended confinement does to identity, to cognition, to a person's relationship with time. He knew, with an academic precision most people never reach, exactly what a life sentence looks like from the inside over decades. He knew. And he still made the choices that put him there. Madison Mogen was 21 years old. Kaylee Goncalves was 21 years old. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. Ethan Chapin was 20 years old. Not one of them had the chance to make a different choice once he had made his. Bryan Kohberger wakes up every morning in that cell. He has the rest of his life to sit with that. And unlike the 4 people whose futures he ended, he has to. The legal chapter of this case is closed. No more motions. No more hearings. No more arguments. From a procedural standpoint, this is finished. What is not finished is the question underneath all of it. Whether permanent, unchanging confinement is proportionate to what was taken from 4 people who were 20 and 21 years old. There is no single answer. The families most affected do not all give the same one. The legal system produced certainty and finality. Whether it produced justice depends entirely on what you believe justice is supposed to do. What the research tells us is that the next several decades inside Idaho maximum security will do something to Bryan Kohberger that no courtroom proceeding could fully capture. The identity he spent 30 years constructing, the academic, the researcher, the person who studied human behavior from a position of authority, will erode. Not suddenly. One identical day at a time. In a space smaller than most people's bathrooms. Surrounded by people who have already completed that process and arrived at something flat and permanent on the other side of it. The legal question is settled. The moral one belongs to all of us. Leave your answer in the comments. Not just a verdict, but your reasoning, because the reasoning is where the real conversation is. If this documentary gave you something to think about, share it with someone who followed this case from the beginning. And if you are new here, this is what the Evidence Hollow does: documented facts, verified sources, no speculation, no assumptions, just the full truth of what happened and what it means. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every case on this channel is built the same way. The truth, reported completely. And in this case, the truth was already more than enough.